are in London with Robert Tavernor, the Emeritus Professor of Architecture and Urban Design at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and among many things, Robert, you're an architect and an urban design expert, and today we're going to talk in a historic context about where London is in its history and where it's going. On the timeline of London's existence, suddenly we're presented with all of these high rises and tall buildings that are coming in. Looking backward and looking forward, what does this mean?
It's part of the urban development of London and the constantly changing character of London that the city's experienced for many, many centuries. Every generation has its taller building, and so the definition of tall clearly has changed by the time we get to the 20th century, 21st century. But clearly the Tower of London, whilst dwarfed by tall commercial buildings in the city now, was a dominating building when it was constructed. Equally, images of St Paul's Cathedral from the river in the mid-18th century, it really was a huge structure placed on Ludgate Hill in the city, and around it were buildings considerably smaller than it. So it was a huge structure and a controversial one, it has to be said. Wren was effectively disgraced by the reaction to it when he'd completed the building, and there was a lot of arguments about the character of his dome that he'd designed. And so all those issues of scale, character, quality that were an issue in the 18th century and 17th century actually continue on into the 21st century. And clearly, since the Second World War, latter part of the 20th century, tall buildings in the American style have begun to emerge in London. They're nothing like the scale, of course, of those in North America or indeed in the Far East. They have a peculiar English character to them, and the way that they're being grouped and shaped by planning policy also means that they have a peculiarly English aspect to them. One of the things that has been key to tall building development in the last 20, 30 years is the move away from isolated tall building structures to clusters of tall buildings, and clusters which are both economic and social clusters linked to transportation nodes. So the idea is to intensify built form in certain parts of London and to minimise the amount that people have to use private vehicles and so on, and to create, and this is the real struggle into the future, to create an environment amidst that density that is properly sustainable and balanced in terms of how people live and work and enjoy their leisure time all in one place. There's been a tendency to separate these things out so that we have the commercial cluster of tall buildings in the City of London, and then the residential clusters tend to be again outside the city centre. I mean, Vauxhall is an area where a huge number of taller buildings are for residential uses are being promoted at the moment. So the different places have different identities according to uses. What we really need into the future are clusters which are more mixed in character in terms of use and are proper, if you like, social and economic melting pots rather than zones of a particular activity.
Did you share the fear of many in the late 1990s about the coming of tall buildings here, and specifically there was a lot of fear that it would diminish St. Paul's? Did you share those fears, and what do you think now?
If you go back to paintings taken from near Waterloo Bridge, the Somerset House River Terrace, and look towards St. Paul's, in the late Victorian era, you'd see gasometers, gas meters, which held town gas, which would go up and down. You saw the new railway lines coming into that part of the city. There were taller buildings and mixed uses, big chimneys belching out smoke from the print works and so on, for example, there. And yet St. Paul's was seen rising above all of that at that time. you go back earlier to the mid-18th century, Canaletto paints views of St Paul's as a supreme structure rising above the usual domestic architecture around it. That's what most people refer to as the image of London that they would like to return to, but it's not a realistic image. London has had to cope down the centuries with changing demands on it. It's expanded hugely since the mid-18th century in terms of population. At one time was the largest city in the world. And all of that has an impact on density, people moving to the core, moving out of the core, moving back in. And clearly there is a need into the future if we're going to avoid, in a small, relatively small country, a huge spreading out of the metropolis into countryside, to contain it and to create hotspots of density and activity. And inevitably tall buildings will have a role in those situations. So then it comes down to a balance. How do you make those tall buildings work well with key heritage assets, as they're referred to in heritage circles, in the most positive way? How do you balance that? There are a whole series of very peculiarly English measures in place which are creating something which will look still like London, will still look like an English city compared to what is happening in other major cities around the world, and that's clearly important. Tall buildings definitely have a role in balancing the future modernity with that long history which offers stability and assurance to many companies and other people who want to locate within London.
Finally, manicured is a very nice description, because when you look at the new business district, you get the impression that everything has been meticulously shaped and placed in just the right way.
Yes.
And the planning process for that seems to take a long time. Is it that careful? Is it longer than it has to be?
Obviously, all developers would like it to be shorter. I mean, a major building project can take 18 months, 2 years or more if it goes to a planning inquiry. The important thing is that in a democratic system that people are allowed a voice, that they are allowed to contribute to a debate. The more of these important major buildings that are built, the more that people engage in that process, the better informed the public becomes, and therefore the level of debate rises, and all of that is important. Every tall building in the City of London, people refer to them as funny shapes. Their shapes have been determined by their locations, how they're seen, what people have reacted to in terms of their impact on their properties, their lives, and so on. So in a way, the people have to some extent shaped those forms. And I think that therefore becomes an expression of a democratic process, which is something to be proud of, rather than actually a more imposed system where developers are allowed to just follow a set of abstract rules in terms of rights of light or zoning conditions and so on. And I think that ultimately that will lead to a city that will be regarded as beautiful and worth preserving in terms of aspects of it into the future.
Robert Tavernor, thank you for coming to see us at CTBUH 2013.
Pleasure, thank you.